do this. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Augmented Intelligence Workshop. Today we have Kevin Zollman from the philosophy side and Sadhana Puntambekar from education side. And as usual, we'll have 25 minutes per our first speaker and a couple minutes of discussion, then 25 more minutes for our second speaker with a little bit of discussion, and then we'll have a joint discussion in the end. As usual, feel free to write any notes or any questions you have anytime in the chat. And Kevin, please take us away.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Marina, and thanks to everyone for coming and for the invitation and the organizers. I really appreciate it. This is an exciting group. Let me just share my screen here really quick. So apologies, you're going to see a little bit of junk, all the like header for the window and all of that, but that's unfortunately the easiest way I have to share the slides, but also see my screen. So thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm really excited to hear what folks have to say about this, because this is a chapter of a book that I'm writing, which is about the interface between networks and what we call social epistemology and philosophy, which is the understanding of the way beliefs spread. So that's the topic of this is one chapter, which looks at pluralistic ignorance. And in particular, I'm interested in this relationship between what you might think of as a kind of social pathology, that is pluralistic ignorance, and individual rational behavior. And so that talk is sort of aimed at this question of like, to what extent does individual rational behavior, is that consistent with or inconsistent with the possibility of having this kind of social pathology? So let me just start with saying briefly what pluralistic ignorance is. Some of you may have already heard this term. There are subtle differences in the way it's defined. Hopefully those subtle differences won't matter for this talk. But the basic idea is something like this. You might imagine a group of friends going out to drink. This is a classic example that's used in the literature. And, you know, they've had 1 or 2 or 7 or whatever drinks. And then, you know, one of the friends suggests, well, shall we get another round? And one of the people participating, one of the friends in this group might say to themselves, well, you know, boy, I don't really like drinking this much, but everybody else seems to be eager to continue staying and drinking. So I guess I'll have another. So privately, they would rather not engage in this behavior, but they feel peer pressure or a desire to conform or something like that that makes them decide to go along. That by itself is not at all particularly mysterious or I think worthy of any deep intellectual discussion. But the interesting version of this phenomena is one where all of the friends privately have exactly the same experience. That is, each of them privately says to themselves, I would rather not do this much drinking, but everybody else seems to want to, and so I'll go along. And that's the pluralistic ignorance part of this. The idea is that all or most of the people privately don't want to engage in a behavior, but they do it anyway because they think that everybody else wants them to, and everyone else goes along with it. So you have a kind of thing where everybody's doing something that they each privately wish that they weren't doing, but they're doing it under the false belief that everybody else wants to do it. So that hence the ignorance part. That's the pluralistic ignorance part of the idea. Pluralistic ignorance has been applied to a huge variety of different things. In fact, it's as a kind of intellectual category used to explain lots of different behaviors. So it's been used to explain both sides of pandemic response. That is, sometimes people think that in vaccine refusing communities that some people might privately want to get a vaccine but don't want to do it because they think no one else in their community wants to get one. And alternatively, on the flip side, people in mask-wearing communities were accused of being subject to pluralistic ignorance, where everyone privately thought masks weren't necessary, but everyone did it because everyone else did. I'm not saying either of those are accurate, by the way. I'm just saying this is trotted out as an explanation. It's used as an explanation in climate change. There's actually been a few studies recently about especially climate change denialist communities, suggesting that privately individuals sort of believe in climate change, but they are unwilling to admit that because they think no one else does. And then lastly, it's been used a lot in business. So there's been a lot of investigation into firms failing, where the idea is that every member of the firm or a lot of members of the firm think that the firm is doing the wrong thing, but they don't want to speak up because they don't want to be the one to contradict the consensus view or something like that. I want to just take a moment and quickly divide the way that pluralistic ignorance gets discussed into kind of two different categories. One is I'm calling preference-based, where the thing that sort of we're ignorant about is whether people like or dislike something. So the binge drinking example is like this. There are lots of others too, like sanitation habits. The other side, and that's the one I really want to focus on, is what I'm calling epistemic pluralistic ignorance. That's where the thing that we're pluralistic ignorant about is not a preference, but a belief. So is climate change occurring? Is the pandemic dangerous? Is COVID dangerous? Is the firm taking an action that will lead to bankruptcy? These sorts of things. I think that there's lots of similarities, and I think a lot of what I'm going to say could be equally applied to the other one, but the model that I'm going to focus on is really looking at the epistemic side. So that's kind of where my focus is going to be. It's important when we think about pluralistic ignorance, some of the ways it gets deployed confuses it with other related social pathologies. And I think it's important to be careful about this precisely because I think these different pathologies have different explanations. So one, especially people who are familiar with economics might know about, is something called information cascades. So in information cascades, the idea is I might have some private information, you might have some private information, and I take one action and that reveals my private information to you, and then you update. You say, oh, that tells me something about what the information Kevin has, and that can go on. More and more and more people update. That's been used as an explanation for things like stock bubbles and a variety of other phenomena in economics. The important difference here is that in the case of pluralistic ignorance, it's the case that people privately still have the belief, but publicly behave differently. So in the case of information cascades, the idea is that I am actually changing my private belief. I say initially, well, I think climate change is real, and then Marina comes along and says, I don't think it's real. Sorry, Marina, I'm making you the fictional climate change denier. And then I say, oh, well, Marina's smart, so I change my mind. That's not a case of pluralistic ignorance. That's more like an information cascade. Pluralistic ignorance requires that I shut up about my belief, but I nonetheless retain it. So I nonetheless continue to believe it. Another important distinction is there are cases where the people who are conforming are a genuine minority in terms of their beliefs. So it might well be that that people, say, who believe in climate change are a minority in their community and they're choosing to conform. That might be a bad thing, we think, but it's not pluralistic ignorance because there's not an ignorance part. They're correct that they're in the minority, and so they're staying quiet because of a correct belief. So pluralistic ignorance requires that people have an incorrect belief about the community that they're in. The last example doesn't really have a name. I've given it the name asymmetric loss. The idea of asymmetric loss is something like, I might just choose not to say something because there's nothing to be gained from it. So, you might suppose that, say, I dislike my friend's new girlfriend, but I don't say anything to them because what's to be gained? And maybe none of us like her, but none of us want to say anything because there's nothing to be gained. That's not a case of pluralistic ignorance. I'm staying quiet for some reason other than misbelief about my community, something like that. Okay, so the critical features of what I'm calling epistemic pluralistic ignorance are most people believe something. Most people who believe it say the opposite, right? So although most people believe in climate change, they say that they don't. And they do the second thing because they're wrong about the first thing. That is, they feel like they are staying quiet because of a false belief about the makeup of their community. That's really the critical thing. Now, as I said, if you look for definitions of pluralistic ignorance in the literature, they will differ, they will add conditions, but I think that this is kind of the core concept. That is, I think every definition entails this one, although it may add extra stuff onto it. So I'm going to call this the core of what is pluralistic ignorance, or at least the epistemic pluralistic ignorance. And so there are three research questions that we might ask about pluralistic ignorance. And those of you that have done stuff in social modeling, like game theory, can understand exactly where these questions are coming from, right? So the first question is a stability question. If we have a community that is in the state of pluralistic ignorance, why doesn't that evaporate? Why doesn't it sort of just naturally correct itself, or does it naturally correct itself? The second is a question of emergence. That is, if we find ourselves in a community of pluralistic ignorance, how did we get here? What is the mechanism that could lead a community to this, what you might think of as a somewhat unusual situation? And then the last question, which is the one that I sort of hinted at the beginning, is it possible that rational individuals could find themselves in this? Or does pluralistic ignorance require, in some sense of that word require, that the individuals be biased or irrational or be succumbed to some kind of bounded rationality or something like that? So I'm going to go through each of these questions in order. And just to sort of give away the ending, I think it's relatively easy to explain stability using some relatively basic concepts in game theory. I think it's actually somewhat hard to explain emergence. We can explain it, but it does require some relatively special circumstances. And so I'm going to suggest that, that there are special circumstances that do give rise to it, but I don't want to say unusual, but they're not, it's not like we would find it everywhere. And then lastly, I think that pluralistic ignorance is in fact consistent with rationality. That's not to say, of course, that everyone is rational, but that the fact that a community is in a state of pluralistic ignorance is not necessarily evidence for their individual irrationality. Okay, so let's start with stability. So I need to give you a model in order to talk about stability. And I'm going to use a very, very rudimentary game theory model, which I think already gets exactly all that we need. So we're going to imagine an individual agent who worries about two things. They have a desire to say what they believe. So that is, they assign some kind of positive utility to speaking honestly, something that we might think of as quite common. But they also assign a positive utility to fitting in. So they also want to say the thing that everyone else is going to say, right? That's the critical thing. And so they have these two conflicting desires, and we'll weight them just by a simple parameter alpha. So higher alpha represents a greater desire to say what one believes, and a lower alpha suggests that a greater desire to fit in. So alpha 0, I don't care about what anyone else thinks or what anyone else says. I'll just say whatever I believe. And at alpha equals 1, I don't care about my belief. I'll just say what I think everyone else is going to do. This, so here's the slightly more formal, but basically the same statement. The critical thing here is that when we embed people in a social network, they're going to care about the proportion of their neighbors. That's what this V term is. The proportion of their neighbors that are saying the thing that they said. So if they say something that parameter weights how common in terms of frequency is the same statement in their community. This is a model that I'm borrowing from Aidan Mohseni and Cole Randall Williams in this paper that I have cited on the screen. They use it for a slightly different purpose, but I actually think it's quite well suited for what we're doing here. Very, very simple. Okay, so what this does for us is it defines a relatively simple coordination game. So if we think about agents who have alpha values somewhere in between 1 and 0, there will often be two equilibria. One where everyone says P, and one where everyone says not P. And that those two equilibria persist even when all the agents believe P or all the agents believe not P. So as a simple illustration of this, those of you that have seen games from game theory before, here's a simple example where each individual has where two individuals each have a relatively low probability in the truth of the statement. So they each think that it's unlikely that the statement is true. And they each have an alpha parameter of 1/4. And here is a rescaled so that I don't have to put obnoxious fractions on the screen, utilities for them. And so you can see that there are two equilibria here. They both say P and they both say not P or equilibria. One of them is better, the one where they're being honest, where they say they don't believe the proposition, but nonetheless, there's an equilibrium where they're stating the opposite of their opinion. So as a result, simple coordination games provide an explanation for why it is that pluralistic ignorance might be stable. That is, it represents a Nash equilibrium in an underlying game. It's an inferior Nash equilibrium. So you see here, they would rather be in the equilibrium where they're being honest. Makes sense. But they find themselves in the equilibrium where they might find themselves in the equilibrium where they're being dishonest. So that's, quick version. We can do this in more detail, but I think it's a relatively quick version of how it is that pluralistic ignorance can be stable. If we assume that people have these two different desires, that creates a circumstance where they're in an equilibrium. Okay, so the second question is the question of emergence. That is, how does pluralistic ignorance come about? And in this case, now we have a little trickier question, because now we have to ask, pluralistic ignorance is an inferior equilibrium. That is, it's an equilibrium which is not the best of all equilibria. So we might ask, how could we end up getting there? And it turns out, for those of you that know a little bit about this stuff, it's not immediately obvious how we would. The first hypothesis that you find in the social psychological literature here is one about, or maybe sociology literature. I guess I don't quite know where the boundaries are always, but is one about contagion. So the idea is that you might start with a minority of people who are true believers, who really have the belief, and that they might sort of infect, in a certain sense, their friends to say the opposite of what they think, and then they might infect their friends, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you have a few small people who really love to drink, they might recruit others who don't really like it, who then themselves might unwittingly recruit others, et cetera, et cetera. I actually think this explanation doesn't work very well, that this requires a relatively precise set of conditions. And the way to argue for that, I can take a relatively simple model. So the idea here is we're going to start with a scale-free network. We're going to seed randomly beliefs of individual agents. They're going to be probabilities, and then we're going to have them iteratively play this game. So they're going to make an announcement. They'll start just by announcing what they believe in the first round. Then they'll see what their neighbors announced on the previous round and do whatever maximizes their utility for the next round. And then they'll continue to do this until the network stabilizes. So a very simple sort of model. And we can ask, how often does pluralistic ignorance emerge? And the answer is extremely rarely. So the critical thing on this graph, there's a blue line at the bottom of each of the graphs. And the blue line represents the proportion of models, of runs of the model, which resulted in pluralistic ignorance. You see the answer is 0. For the sake of time, I'm not going to walk through all the details of what's in this graph. So let's just pay attention to the blue lines. But the dots and the triangles represent other measures of the proportion of people that are saying different things in the network. So even in cases where people are have a relatively high desire of conformity, it's still the case that we don't see a lot of pluralistic ignorance. Now, that assumed that the beliefs were sort of randomly distributed across agents over the network. We might imagine, what if the true believers are concentrated in the most connected? So one of the things about scale-free networks is that those people who are most central, or there are people who are very central, who have lots of social connections. What if we make those people the biggest outliers in terms of the belief? And indeed, in that situation, we can end up with quite a bit of pluralistic ignorance. Now, what I'm doing here is the most extreme version of this. So I'm ordering I start out by ordering a collection of beliefs and ordering a collection of agents. The agents are ordered by their degree, how many friends they have, and I'm giving those who are most central with the highest degree, the most extreme beliefs. So this is an extreme example. But in that setting, so long as the average belief is not too extreme itself, it's possible for us to get pluralistic ignorance. That's that light blue line there. So you see that when the average belief is relatively close to 50%, pluralistic ignorance is pretty easy to get. Okay, so that's possible. The contagion explanation is possible, but it requires a very strong correlation between social location and belief. So it's a possible explanation, but it does require some relatively special circumstances. Okay, so that's just what this slide says. Contagion is a possible explanation, but it requires a correlation between social influence and belief. The second explanation, which I think is more plausible, is that pluralistic ignorance might arise in the context of belief change over time. So here, now the question is, we might have agents who are not being socially influenced. That is, their belief doesn't change as a result of others around them, but you might imagine they're receiving evidence from the world. So they're reading the newspaper, or they're doing a scientific experiment, or whatever. And that evidence from the world is slowly changing their belief in a sort of exogenous way. So there, it might be that everyone starts out as a true believer, but over time, their belief degrades. But the fact that they want to conform can leave a shadow of their prior belief. So there now the community everyone can change privately, but it's never observed because people are still trying to conform to the belief that everybody else has. So that's another possible explanation. So to do this model, it's relatively straightforward. We can start, imagine everybody starts by believing some proposition, and over time the belief slowly changes. So their private belief slowly goes from, say, almost certain to almost certain than not. It models some kind of outside force like learning. This is just 3 illustrative examples from, again, a scale-free network. So this isn't a collection of runs, but rather 3 individual runs that are representative. On the x-axis here is time. On the y-axis is how many people are declaring that they believe the proposition. So at the far left of this graph, everybody believes the proposition. They start out by saying everybody believes the proposition, and we have no case of pluralistic ignorance. But at time equals 50, that's when they cross that threshold. So now they go from having a probability in the belief above 50% to having a probability in the belief below 50%. And so now, if they're declaring that they believe the proposition, they're no longer they're in a case of pluralistic ignorance, or at least they're no longer being honest. The green line here represents a situation where those people who are most socially central have the greatest desire to conform. So these are the people who really, really want to conform. So the socially central also have a high desire to conform. The blue line represents people's desire to conform is allocated at random, and the red line represents the people at the center are the most honest. These are the people who just don't care about conformity and just say what they believe. And you get exactly what you would expect. That is, if the people in the center have the highest potential to conform, you see that you persist in various states of pluralistic ignorance for a much longer time period. I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but if we look here, even at the far extreme of the graph, where everyone is almost certain that the proposition is false, for the green line especially, there's still clusters of people who continue to say the other thing. So so that shows that the change over time explanation is relatively plausible. Okay, so just to sum up quickly, the second question, how can it emerge? Contagion is possible, but requires relatively special circumstances. Belief change over time is more plausible and doesn't require as special a circumstance, although nonetheless, there are things that can make it more or less likely to come about. So the last question that I promised to talk about, is it possible for rational individuals to be in pluralistic ignorance? Well, this is a little tricky of a question. Let me start by being honest about an assumption. I'm assuming that the Mohseni-Williams model that I started with is in a certain sense, a rational utility function to have. Philosophers will grumble sometimes about whether any utility function is rational, but I'm going to preserve the kind of economic way of thinking about this where your utility function is your own. And so we'll say that agents who have that are rational, or at least could be rational. So with that, that's number one here. If we assume that it's rational for you to care about what others think about you, then the answer to the second question is yes, rational individuals can in fact find themselves in pluralistic ignorance. There's a more detailed Bayesian model that I could give you, but let me just give you a quick explanation, and then those of you who are interested in the more sophisticated Bayesian model can probably already see how it would work. In the beginning, I don't know anything about you. I don't know your degree of conformity, and I don't know what you believe. And so I might think all possibilities are open. It might be that you believe or disbelieve the proposition. In this case, those are the columns. And I might also think that it's possible that you either have a high degree of conformity or you don't care about conformity. So, and those are the rows. When I see you do something that is consistent with what everyone else is doing, I can eliminate one of these 4 possibilities. The thing I know for sure is that it's not the case that you disbelieve the proposition and you don't care about conformity, right? All the other 3 possibilities remain, but if you just count them up, there are more possibilities where you believe the proposition than possibilities where you don't. And so a Bayesian agent who initially uniformly assigned a prior over all 4 possibilities would increase their probability that you actually believe the proposition. And so as a result, it is in fact rational for a Bayesian agent to, when they come into that community where everybody's drinking, to say, I guess people like drinking. So this is sort of in contrast to some things you see in the literature that suggest that Bayesian agents can't find themselves in pluralistic ignorance. Here's a picture of the more formal one, but I'm out of time. So let me stop there. and just sum up very quickly, pluralistic ignorance is an interesting phenomena. It's relatively easy to explain its stability. It's somewhat harder to explain its emergence, but possible under certain circumstances. And lastly, pluralistic ignorance does not require that individual agents be biased or irrational in any particular way, that rational agents can find themselves there. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry to kind of race through a bunch of different things, but hopefully if there's anything that was unclear, we can clear it up in the questions.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was really thought-provoking, and I would invite people to raise a couple of questions that they have. So I see several questions in the chat, and maybe we could start with any one of these. Maybe Ishan or Stephen would like to jump in.
I mean, great talk. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if polarized groups, where you have groups which are clustered more together, that probably creates conditions that are great for, something like this.
It's an interesting question. I haven't looked into it. My initial reaction would be that, well, let's see. I mean, it's interesting in that I think that high clustering would make it very difficult for pluralistic ignorance to spread from one side to the other, so to speak, which is if we imagine, say, right now that, I don't know, the American left features pluralistic ignorance about some fact. It would be very unlikely that that would then cause pluralistic ignorance amongst the American right, because there wouldn't be a way for that social influence to spread from one side to the other. On the other hand, highly clustered networks might make it so that it might make that graph very resistant to change as a result of changing belief over time. So I would say that probably my supposition is that clustering or polarization would help to attenuate the belief change explanation, but would provide a problem for the contagion explanation. That would be my initial conjecture. Now, I haven't looked at it, and I actually think I'll make a note to myself because I think it would be an interesting thing to investigate. So if that's a guess rather than the result of any particular simulations or analysis.
So, I mean, so it's polarized plus also individuals sampling their own information. So I might be in a polarized group and I believe a certain different piece of information, but because I'm in that group, I can't accept that. I mean, so I see what you're saying, but that could sort of lead to something like that.
And one other thing that polarization might, a wrinkle that we might add into this, I'm assuming in the model, very simply, that all I care about is the belief of the agents that I'm connected to. But in a polarized group, it might be more complicated. I might be interested in having the same announcement as people who are similar to me, but I also might be interested in having a different announcement than people who are different than me. And so that would be not just modeling the social network, but also modeling the differences of individual desires. And that actually might, now, I mean, I'm just talking right now, so I haven't thought about it too much. But that actually might lead to pluralistic ignorance in a different way, which is I might come to start saying something because those people over there say the opposite and I just want to annoy them. And then maybe that could perpetuate pluralistic ignorance. It seems plausible to me, but I'd have to think about it a little bit.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
I saw Nicholas on the line to ask a question, if you still want to do that.
Yeah, I put my hand down because I wasn't sure what the time was like. Hey, Kevin. Super interesting talk. What about an information story here? When you and I go out drinking and it's getting towards the end of the night, but we both still have full glasses, which sends a fairly strong signal that we're still drinking, right? We have no signal though that the other person wants to go home when in fact they do, right? And so if you have a model where there's some subset of the information signals that can be sent, and then just a simple, how accurate is my interpretation of the signals? How appropriate are the signals? It seems like you could get a lot of the emergence. Obviously, I haven't modeled any of this, but just a couple of thoughts. Happy to discuss more offline if you're interested.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, because one of the things I'm assuming here is that the underlying information, wherever my beliefs come from to begin with, is just it's just a random draw. But what you're suggesting is that there might be situations where we have a certain sort of asymmetry of signals. That is, I might have a very strong belief of one thing, I might get a signal that gives me a very strong belief in one direction, but a different kind of signal that gives me a relatively weak belief in the other direction. And the asymmetry of signal construction, or the asymmetry of initial belief distribution or something, might make it more likely. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about it. In these cases, I'm always using a distribution which is symmetric about the mean. So I'm using a beta distribution to draw random beliefs. Well, no, it's not always symmetric about the mean. I guess I shouldn't say that. But it doesn't have that feature that you're describing. And so it would be interesting to think about, like, what would happen with very asymmetric kinds of distributions of initial beliefs. Could that lead to pluralistic ignorance just because of something about that? I haven't investigated it, but it would definitely be something to think about. And as you say, it's quite plausible in some of the real circumstances.
All right, and Mitch gets the last question.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Kevin, I found it really interesting. I hope my camera's working. I guess I have a question that maybe is a little bit of a backup or zooming out. On these epistemological frames that you're working in, I feel as though you're making you're positioning them that these beliefs end up driving these actions. And I kind of wonder what happens if you sort of rethink that order and think, well, maybe people are doing actions and then they sort of, their beliefs or their knowledge states kind of align with those actions rather than the reverse. And I'm wondering if you have thought this through, what the implications are for the basic architectures of these models.
Yeah, I have thought about it a little bit, because in some of these cases, especially in the preference cases, it seems quite plausible that my actions might drive my beliefs. The fact that I go out drinking might cause me to come to like it more, or something like cognitive dissonance on the belief side. The fact that I keep saying that I don't believe something might actually cause me to stop believing it, or something like that. I think that part of the reason that I ignore that is not because I don't think it's plausible. In fact, I think it's quite plausible. But actually, it would make pluralistic ignorance far more difficult to sustain. Because the critical thing for pluralistic ignorance is that I declare one thing, but privately believe or want something different. If my public declaration destabilizes that belief or desire, changes it, then pluralistic ignorance will sort of naturally collapse on its own. Not always in a good way necessarily, but I'll just come to like the thing that I claim to or that I initially disliked, or I might come to believe the thing that I initially disbelieved. And so I made the assumption precisely because I was sort of trying to look for the best case scenario for pluralistic ignorance, because I already think it's somewhat difficult for it to emerge. If we added in that wrinkle, that would only make it even more difficult for pluralistic ignorance to emerge. And so part of the reason that I excluded it was precisely because I was sort of interested in this intellectual exercise of, like, in the best case, how is it going to come about? But you're absolutely right. In a more realistic, full model of how individuals believe, we would have to include some potential for their behavior to affect their beliefs or desires in one way or another.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's transition to the second talk. And Kevin, as you might see, there's a lot of activity in the chat and a lot more questions. So please take a look at those, and we can return to them after the end of Sadhana's talk.
Okay, let me try share my screen. I hope you're seeing the presentation. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this very interesting series. And we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how middle school students write science explanations. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing in the last couple of years, where we are trying to integrate automated feedback from an NLP algorithm and support that is provided by teachers, and trying to understand how we can help middle school students write better science explanations. My collaborators on this project are Becky Passano and Chanmin Kim, both of who are from PSU. And Becky is the natural language processing specialist in this project, and we're using some of the techniques that she has used in the past. A big shout out to all of my team members, some of who are attending this talk today, graduate students and researchers who have helped a lot in this work. So why science explanations? As many of you probably know, writing science explanations is an important aspect of learning science. But it is a challenging competency for students to learn and also for teachers to support. So students often don't understand what science explanations are and how to write complete causal accounts of science phenomena that they have investigated either in their experiments or have researched or learned in their classrooms. They also have difficulty explaining relationships between science phenomena or science ideas because they're more used to writing fact-based single sentence, a couple of sentence questions. But there is now a push to help students write better science explanations, mainly because of the national science standards. And we see a lot of classrooms in which students actually are asked to write science explanations. It's also really hard for teachers to support writing science explanations. First, it's hard to provide timely and detailed feedback. You have a classroom of students who are writing maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs each, 25 to 30 essays, and it's difficult to provide feedback in a timely manner, and also detailed feedback that students can actually work with to revise their essays. It's also difficult to provide feedback on multiple drafts, and this happens to all of us. And very often students don't include evidence in their science explanations, and for teachers to go back to each essay and help students with that particular competency is also really hard. So what we are doing, and I'm going to present results from like the first study from this project, is to use a natural language algorithm to provide students with automated feedback on a timely basis immediately after they submit their essays, and also provide teachers with a summary of students writing from a class or from multiple classes, so that the teachers can also use this in their instruction. And this is happening almost in real time. So students submit their essays, they get feedback, we present a summary to the teachers so that there is more timely feedback for students to revise on their essays. And the research context that we're working in is middle school science students. We have a physics curriculum in which students are asked to design a roller coaster. So basically they're learning important ideas in mechanics, forces, motion, energy, and so on. And they use simulations to design roller coasters and iteratively design them. And they write 2 essays, one after learning about energy, and then they revise that and write a second essay. And we conducted a study. So this was the first study of this project that I'm going to present. So any feedback after I present the results would be most welcome. And we're using peer eval, which is the NLP program that Becky has worked on for a few years. In the past, peer eval has only been used to do post hoc analyses of students' writing, but we adapted this algorithm to provide students with real-time feedback on their essays. And the way that peer eval works is that it searches for key content units or CUs, and it creates a model of important propositions that are derived from a small set of reference responses. And in the reference responses, we're using a range of different kinds of responses, essays from students. It then creates vector representations of the propositions and then compares the full propositions to recognize paraphrases of the same content. So in our particular unit, we used 15 main ideas or content units that are important for students students to learn. And we also group them into 4 themes that I'll talk about in a second. So these are basically the 15 ideas. They go from CU0 to 14, and they cover a range of content in forces, motion, and energy, such as potential energy of an object comes from its height, the car has maximum potential energy at the highest point, and so on, law of conservation of energy, how mass affects energy and speed, and so on. For the sake of providing students with feedback, we actually group the content units into 4 main ideas. So the vector representations for like the 14 content units, 15 content units were condensed into 4 main ideas. And we did this basically because it's really hard to give feedback on like 15 content units in real time and expect students to parse through that and understand what the feedback means, because if a student has missed, let's say, 18 out of the 15 ideas, then providing feedback about each of them and helping students understand what that feedback means is really not very practical in a classroom. So we condensed them into 4 main ideas. And as you see here, the 4 main ideas capture a bunch of separate ideas. Like, for example, the one theme is when the car moves down the hill, kinetic energy increases and potential energy decreases. So the different content units that can be part of this main idea are potential energy at top equals kinetic energy at bottom, higher height equals higher potential energy. And then the different paraphrases of this particular idea are given here at the bottom of the slide. Potential energy is based on an object's height, energy due to height, and they are the same idea being represented in different ways by students. So we used these ideas to help students to provide students with feedback. But in addition to that, as I mentioned a minute back, we also provided teachers with summary feedback from students' essays. So what content units were covered, what were missed on a class basis or like a multiple class basis. And right now the representation of that is pretty simple, but teachers could at a glance see a summary of what students covered or not covered. And we're working on how to present teachers with better summaries as we learn a lot of things from this particular study. So, what did we find? We conducted our one study with almost 300 students last year. And this is an example of students' essays. As you can see, this essay is pretty good. And the students wrote pretty exhaustive accounts of how their roller coaster worked and what are the different parameters they used in their roller coaster design. And the feedback also was aligned quite well with the students' explanation. So the feedback said to the student, you did a great job explaining relations between height and energy and also mass and energy. And pretty much this student did everything, explained all of the ideas pretty well, but that wasn't always the case. We found that students' writing improved from essay 1 to essay 2, or more accurately, I should say that peer eval was able to identify more content units in essay 2 as compared to essay 1. So the graph here shows that other than CU8, pretty much in essay 2, you saw a higher incidence of content units overall for all of the content units. We also ran a Wilcoxon sign rank test and found that higher number of students included at least 5 of the CUs. For some other CUs like 1, 7, and 12, what happened was that because we used a very stringent Bonferroni adjustment, the p-values were below 0.5, but they were not significant. So overall, there was improvement in essay 2 as compared to essay 1. So how did students use the feedback? I have some examples here with essay 1 responses and the feedback that they got in essay 2. So if you look at row 1, this student didn't write anything about the connection between mass and energy. And a part of the feedback said, also write about how mass affects potential energy and kinetic energy. And this is just one part from the overall feedback that the student received. And you can see that the student said a lot more mass affects PE because the more mass you have, the more PE you have, and so on. Similarly, if you look at row 3, the student talked about law of conservation of energy. The feedback asked the student to think more about how height affects PE and KE and how that they can use that to explain conservation of energy. And in the third column, you can see the student has then talked more about the connection between potential and kinetic energy and what that means for the law of conservation of energy. But this wasn't always the case. A lot of the students just repeated what they wrote in essay 1 and the same verbatim in essay 2. You can see in row 1 of the table, the feedback asked student to write about how mass affects potential and kinetic energy, and the student repeated exactly the same thing that they wrote in essay 1. Similarly, in row 2, you can see it's almost the same thing that the student reported in essay 2. So we found that making revisions was not really very easy for students, and there were a few challenges that we found in our work in this particular study. First of all, there were many issues that impacted peer eval's effectiveness. Students, these are 11, 12-year-olds, they often use little or no punctuation in an essay. We had an essay that had 250 words with no punctuation whatsoever. And as you can imagine, the feedback was not accurate for this particular essay. We also did some post-analysis on the length of the sentences that students wrote and to see whether that impacted peer eval's effectiveness to identify the content units. And we found that, if the sentence was more than 25 words, then it decreased peer eval's effectiveness in identification of the CUs. Of course, things like spelling errors and grammatical errors and other issues with punctuation, such as putting a lot of periods or a lot of commas, all of those things also affected how or not peer eval could identify the particular CUs. And the other very important factor that we found was that students' ideas were scattered over multiple sentences. So there was a lot of repetition of ideas. Students would write, PE affects KE in one sentence, and then I did this because PE affects KE. And it was like the same idea being repeated several times in different contexts, which is fine when a human reader is evaluating the essays. But for peer eval, it was hard to identify those CUs in student essays. The other important issue, which we're working on right now, is that students found it really hard to interpret the feedback. So even though we had grouped the content units into 4 main ideas and had designed our feedback based on those 4 ideas, if the student had missed all 4 of them, it was really hard for students to address those multiple ideas, and it was overwhelming to understand the feedback and make the revisions. They also did not understand what they should tackle first and how to revise a specific thing and then go to the next one. And students may not also have understood the science well enough to be able to interpret the feedback. So making revisions was not easy for students. And with one of my students, Shisong, who is probably on this call, we're looking at, we're analyzing the revisions that students made, and we found that there were at least 4 kinds of revisions that students made. Some of them added the same content, like you saw in the example that I showed. They just added sentences that, you know, they had previously included. Some students added additional content. So they added sentences that explain ideas they did not include earlier. Some students clarified previous writing, so they made corrections in grammar and spelling or sentence structure. And there were a minority of students who actually rewrote their essays. They took the feedback and they went to their essays and actually revised the sentences from their previous essay to make a more integrated, cohesive essay too. So here is some data on revision behaviors. As you can see, the highest proportion of students added similar content, and you know, some of the students actually did rewrite the essays. So since this was our first implementation of this algorithm in the classroom, and we really didn't know how it would work in real time, and it's one thing to do a post hoc analysis using an NLP technique and analyze how students are writing, but it's another thing to take the values that you're getting from that and change that into feedback that can be meaningful for students. So it has been, it's a long process, and we're in the process of revising not only the model, but also how we can use teachers better in the classroom. So we're currently refining the model based on the new classroom data from this study. And we're looking at ways in which we can, you know, do some pre-processing where, you know, we can ask students to actually check spelling and grammar and write concise sentences. We're also looking at how we can simplify the feedback. So make the feedback more specific and concise, such as like having a list of the main ideas and have a smiley face if students have included that idea. So kind of give them a list of the ideas explained and the ideas missing, and not overwhelm them with a lot of verbal feedback. But students' writing is not always cohesive, as I have said. So we are also looking at how we can enable teachers to support students to revise their essays. So for example, you know, teachers can take a model essay with feedback highlighted and show why they got the feedback that they got, because a lot of times peer eval didn't identify a specific CU, and the student would go to the teacher and say, but I said this, and it still tells me that I didn't write about it. But it did that because the writing was not very concise, and the writing was not, the idea was not expressed in a way that could be understood, in a way that was scientific. So we are also working with teachers to help them come up with a mechanism to help students reflect on why they might have received the feedback that they received. And also providing teachers with more information about students' progress. What we did in this study was very basic, like the 0-1, you know, content covered or not covered. We are looking at providing teachers with a dashboard that quickly helps them look at the trends across classrooms, across different teachers, and so that they can make better instructional decisions. And also helping individual students in understanding why they received the feedback that they did. One idea is to use peer groups, but that probably won't be in the next implementation, because there is a lot of that we need to do to revise what we found from this particular study. So in summary, what we found was that peer eval was good in providing timely feedback. Kids could get like a quick summary of ideas found or missing. And we could provide students with multiple rounds of feedback, and also provide summary data to teachers, but we needed the teachers' help to model how to revise, to help students reflect on their essays, and also focusing on like big ideas. So if a student wrote something about conservation of energy, the teacher could talk about that and explain how the other sub ideas relate to those ideas, and basically how teachers could design information based on the trends that they see in their classroom. So there's a lot of work ahead, and any feedback is welcome.
Great. Thank you very much. This is very interesting work, and I see several questions in the chat already. I see Mitch, I think, was the first to ask a question. Do you want to raise it in person?
Oh, sure. I don't want to monopolize, but really interesting to see how you're bringing all these resources together. And I guess the question I had to do with seeing a difference between feedback that was written as questions back to the student and other forms of feedback that were written more as statements, like provide more of this. And I wonder, I could imagine these have different ways of influencing how students think about the ideas that are being mentioned in the feedback, and that questions, could lead to different kinds of processes than statements. And I'm wondering if you see differences, and also just curious on the design side, how you or how the team decided when and whether to use questions versus propositional statements.
Yeah, so the feedback that I showed was only like snippets of particular of the whole feedback. So we had a statement and followed by a question. So most of the feedback that we had both of the things, but we weren't very purposeful about using one or the other. But that's a great point that, having more reflection kind of questions would be very useful. For students. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's good to know that. So
Yeah.
Probably your students are actually seeing, in many cases, a combination of a statement and then a question that
Yes.
is directing them to be constructive. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I get to go next then. Thanks, Sadhana. That was great. I guess I don't intend this to be a snarky question, but I'm just wondering, how good does peer eval have to be for it not to kind of alienate students or incentivize them just to like spit out a bunch of keywords like, oh, I'll bet peer evalu is just wanting me to say something about potential energy. So I don't actually have a coherent thought about potential energy, but I'm just going to list it as a sort of a keyword. So I'm just wondering how much of the students' response is kind of trying to figure out what peer evalu is capable of doing.
Yeah, like gaming the system. And we're not quite there yet because students wrote pretty exhaustive essays. And that's one of the things that we really worked hard to do in our feedback, not really giving students like, explain potential energy or explain kinetic energy, but more thinking about, how they could, what they could say about the relation between the two. So it wasn't just, writing about those facts, but actually explaining those. And that's one of the reasons why I said that this is like a more synergistic thing, because our students have been writing essays for a long time. And it's the teachers who ask them to write a design essay. So some of that is also in the prompt that, you explain why your roller coaster car will make it to the end of the ride. And students have to explain in terms of like the data that they found in their simulations. So it's I think it's not just about peer eval. This is about the entire instructional pedagogical principles that the unit is based on, that students are constantly encouraged to write more about and explain the relations between ideas. I don't know whether that answers your question. And I have to say that that's one of the reasons why we are working on revising the feedback, so it's not just something that says correct, P correct, K correct, conservation of energy correct, and so on.
Kevin?
Great, thank you very much for the talk. So I'm a philosophy professor. One of the things that really jumped out at me, because it just is very like with my experience teaching, was this question about like what motivated students to do a more like holistic rewrite of the essay versus make a small change. Because one of the things that, I have no data on this, but just is sort of the thing that philosophy professors always complain about is that, you know, you'll mark in a paper like, I have a concern here that is really sort of a holistic concern, like the whole argument fails at this moment or something. And then what students will do is they'll go in and add a sentence like, you know, trying to correct as if it's like a grammatical mistake. And you're like, no, like that problem was like the whole thing fell apart. Like you needed to rethink the whole paper. So I don't know, did you get any sense in the data or do you have any theories about what things prompted students to have a more holistic rethink to the paper versus what caused them to do a little more like localized changes?
No, but I think that would be a great idea to look into further, like, you know, what motivates students to kind of go and completely revise their essays as opposed to just doing little cosmetic revisions.
So I was also wondering about the your approach. So it seems like it isolates a particular part of educating students about science, in particular writing essays, which, as you said, crucially depends on how they understand the concepts themselves. They can have misunderstood the crucial parts, and in this way, they might not be able to rewrite the essay in the way that would be good for the purpose of the essay. So I was wondering if you thought of integrating the Piraval approach with other systems that help students understand concepts more. So I don't know, simulational approach comes to mind or something else. Yeah.
So you know, what I didn't have a whole lot of time to talk about is that this is embedded within a design-based, inquiry-based unit. So students go through the entire scientific process and they think about the problem, they restate the problem and come up with hypotheses about what they would do. And we have a simulation, a roller coaster simulation that they conduct multiple experiments in and actually design different kinds of roller coasters. And there are several like whole class discussions after each of those simulation experiments. So the essay is kind of like the culminating artifact that they create after they've done a lot of these other things.
Yeah, I was maybe to add a little bit, I was wondering if the essay was turned out to be incomplete or indicated some misunderstanding of the concepts, if this could be feedback to the other parts of the education where you teach the contents and people can go back to these other simulations or some other contents to understand better.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we're doing right now, which is not complete, is looking at content tracing. So after each of their design iterations, students reflect on their designs and write about, you know, like analysis, short answers or short examples of what worked and what didn't work. And we're looking at what content ideas were expressed in those, and then finally into their essays. So looking at the content tracing, whether the content traveled all the way into their essays, and if not, then providing them with more scaffolding after each of the design iterations.
Great talk. I really enjoyed it. But the one question that I constantly had was, so what is the model? Is it like a lexical, syntactical model? Is it a deep learning model?
It's not a deep learning model, and Becky is the expert on that. It's a wise crowd model. So it takes essays from example essays and actually uses propositions from that to create a pyramid. And then those are that is used to assess further essays. So it takes a range of essays to create the first model.
So how does it learn to identify a certain content unit?
It's a vector-based model, and you would have to ask Becky the the NLP mechanism of that, which I won't be able to explain it well enough. So
really interesting.
All right, so I would like to open the discussion on both Kevin's and Sadhana's talks. Please raise your hand or speak up if you have comments on any of these. And yeah, okay, Rob.
So this is a question for Kevin's talk, and it involves speculation beyond what he was talking about. But what your discussion of pluralistic ignorance really underscores for me is the social capital that a community has because they have a certain endemic level of expressing a belief. Right. So like if the prevailing rate of people believing climate science is high, then I'm going to rationally be motivated to say what I really think about climate science. But if it's low, then you get this sort of emergent pluralistic ignorance that you were describing. So I'm just wondering whether that kind of dynamic makes you think that there should be certain kinds of societal interventions that we should be entertaining, others that we don't. So I don't know whether this is valid for moral or equity reasons, but it seems like if you can nudge a community so that its endemic rate of expressing a belief is high, then you could end up with a positive feedback system, and that will be self-sustaining. But if you try to nudge a society where there was only 10% belief in climate change or expression of climate change, then you'll raise it to 20% maybe, but that's like wasted money because it'll just fall back down as soon as you take away that source. So I'm just asking about like what this suggests about interventions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, one of the things I didn't talk about, but I did look at, and it's in the chapter of the book, is that on the contagion explanation. So that's the idea that how often can a minority of initial true believers cause there to be broad pluralistic ignorance. The scale-free network was the one that made that most plausible. So the massive inequality in social connections made it so that it was most likely that a couple of true believers could lead to pluralistic ignorance. So on the intervention side, I think one thing it suggests is that if you want to try and prevent pluralistic ignorance, without necessarily trying to intervene on the side of one belief or another, just creating sort of, insofar as you can, of course, a little bit of a flatter degree distribution. That is, so you don't have a social community where you have a few people with a ton of social connections and a lot of people with very few, precisely because that then makes it much harder for that initial crystal to form that then affects everyone else. I think that might be a little bit better of an intervention than one where we're really trying to like ensure that both beliefs are represented or something like that, precisely because, as you say, there are other ethical concerns with the idea of like, well, not many people are flat earthers out there. So just to make sure that it's not pluralistic ignorance, let's throw a bunch of flat earth opinions out in the world, precisely because you might be worried about other consequences. So my preferred intervention would be to think about interventions on the structure of the network. The problem is that doesn't really solve the belief change over time issue. And there I'm a little less sure what would be a sort of natural intervention. Except for something like creating the opportunities for people to sort of say like, I've changed my mind or something, but I'm not even sure that would help. So anyway, half an answer for you, but yeah, it's definitely something worth thinking about. I should also mention, by the way, this is a big area of research for the philosopher Cristina Bicchieri, who some of you may have run across her work before. She's really interested in how do you destroy pluralistic ignorance when it's present. So she's really interested in this question of when are social norms really counterproductive? And so how can you get people to stop engaging in really counterproductive social behavior that they don't like, but that they're doing out of desire to conform. And so you might also take a look at her most recent book, Norms in the Wild, is really interesting and has a much more, they're very hyper concrete, like she's really thinking about like in this particular setting, how do we do it? But they're also really interesting. So I'd suggest take a look at it.
Yeah, maybe to follow up on the intervention question, And to also bring up a little bit of Sadhana's expertise here, do you think teaching people about the mechanisms and the phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance might make them less likely to exhibit it at a social level? Yeah, I guess a question to both.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I honestly don't know. It would be worth investigating, like just, if you found a community that was in pluralistic ignorance and then you said, hey, here's a thing that might happen. Does that lead them to think, oh, maybe that's happening right now? Yeah, I don't know. It would be interesting to know. There was a little bit of stuff in the chat too. One of the education relevant ways that I think pluralistic ignorance can come up is in imposter syndrome. So Tony asked about that, and I think Rob gave the answer that I would have given, which is that a lot of people think, oh, this is hard. This isn't hard for anyone else, but it's hard for me. So I don't want to admit that it's hard because I think everybody else is having an easy time. And I wonder if that's a case where you might find pluralistic ignorance in the classroom. And then you might wonder about intervention. I mean, usually the classic intervention in that case is to say, it's hard for everyone, and then that sort of it. The teacher kind of comes in and makes a public announcement. But maybe it would be interesting to know, like in those cases, whether there might be other interventions that might be more plausible in other cases.
Yeah, so one more question I had beyond what was discussed in the chat already, maybe to you, Kevin, is basically whether the difficulty that you have encountered when you try to simulate pluralistic ignorance and to make it stabilize in a community, whether this speaks to the frequency of these effects and how we think about them in the real world. So do your simulations inform you about the frequency of pluralistic ignorance?
I think so. That's the conclusion that I sort of have drawn from a lot of this, is that I think that pluralistic ignorance might be a little bit more rare than people are prone to think of it. I think it's one of those, it's such a I don't want to call it a cute example because it's cute's the wrong word, but it's such a I don't know, it's a theoretical thing that people kind of like, and so they often postulate it existing. But as I said, there are other similar nearby explanations, like information cascades or the conformity of people who genuinely are in the minority, or asymmetric loss. So I'm suspicious that it may be used more frequently, precisely because it requires, I think, relatively special circumstances to come about. I think that it's probably a little bit more rarer than the social psychological or sociologists tend to think, because they love to sort of say, oh, here's an example, here's an example, here's an example. But I also don't think it's impossible, because I do think that preference change over time or belief change over time is a real phenomenon. So one example I think it probably is a good one is the persistence of LGBTQ people staying in the closet, especially in the late 90s, when we saw a long time persistence of that and then a relatively quick collapse of it. I think that was probably a case where people became more tolerant over time, but in a way that wasn't publicly observable. So I do think it's a real phenomenon. I do think that it does really exist, but I'm also think that it should maybe be, it's one of those things where we should presume that it's not pluralistic ignorance until somebody proves to us that it is, rather than the other way around, which sometimes I think when I read some of this literature, I worry that people are too quick to assume that's what it is. So, yeah, that's my.
I have a question if no one else is going. So this is again for you, Kevin. You analyzed all of this through networks and through belief and updating, right? But I'm wondering if there's something about the content of the belief itself, that makes something likely to become something that could become a pluralistic ignorance sort of an issue.
That's a good question, and I'm not sure. I mean, you might imagine that with respect to some beliefs, our desire to conform might be stronger than with respect to others. You might think, well, my belief about which ice cream flavor is better is not the kind of thing that people are going to, judge me about, whereas my belief that might be tied in with religion or might be tied in with politics might be subject to more desire to conform. So that certainly could be one. One thing Christina Bicchieri emphasizes a lot, so this isn't my idea, this is hers, is that she thinks pluralistic ignorance oftentimes comes about in settings where there are other social norms that prohibit you from talking around the belief. So, so she talks about like the examples of like mutilation of children, which is common in some cultures, where people privately express that they don't want to do this, but they feel like they have to because they think other people expect them to do it. And those are often cultures where talking about the practice is also taboo. And so any articulation of, I did this, but I really wish I didn't, or I wish we stopped doing this, is taboo. And so she thinks that that might be one of the things that perpetuates pluralistic ignorance, is not just the belief itself, but rather a larger set of taboos that make it impossible to sort of start to gently try and figure your way out of this, or to say something like, oh, you know, I'm a devout religious person, but maybe I don't believe the leader about this one thing. Well, but if you make it taboo to say anything or to ever disagree with the leader or something like that, then maybe that might create it. So that's Christina's idea, but seems quite plausible to me that there might be this larger social setting that creates a constellation of beliefs that then makes it harder to sort of get into the thing about which we have pluralistic ignorance.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Yeah.
I have just an observation or question about a information loop that's blocked in a typical classroom that might be a way of overcoming PI in the classroom, and maybe relevant to the other project here too. And it's that generally students don't know where they fall in the stack by a qualitative measure of seeing what else is in the stack. So often I'll say to a student who comes up and asks, why did I get a B? It's like, well, if you could see the rest of the papers, it would be clear. So I've explored various avenues of making it clear, co-written papers, all of which get read in the class and so on and so forth, so that all of the students are exposed to all of the data. They participate in the evaluation process in a very transparent way. And in fact, in some places where I thought I would be violating privacy, they've actually asked to see who ranked where. All of them universally wanted to know that. So that kind of top-down feedback loop, it seems to me, is intentionally blocked by our concerns about privacy in the US. And I just want to throw that out as to see what kinds of comments you guys might have about that, if any.
I agree. Actually, I think that's something where actually it's a really good connection to the thing I was just saying, because I think that's right, that like privacy laws are another way that can make it so like you can't say to somebody like everyone else is struggling, right? So like I'm director of graduate studies. I talk to students who are like, oh, I'm doing so much worse than everyone else, and it's like I can say generic things like I don't think you're doing worse than everyone else, but I can't go like that student's doing worse than you because even though it might be helpful to the student that's in front of me. So yeah, I do wonder, the privacy laws may be another thing that serve in a similar purpose.
Yeah, I think in our case, it's even harder because we are working with kids, and the IRB issues are really they're very stringent. So we've been working with teachers to show students like anonymous essays from the previous year, and show things that are better or worse, and really have a discussion about why something is better or worse, rather than pointing to, hey, everybody else is having a problem with this, but really reasoning about why something is the way it is.
Great. I see there again many questions in the chat. If somebody would want to raise them in person, that would be great.
I was just on that last thing. I was just saying, I wonder if it would be helpful or harmful if for each of those little things that you give to the students, say, oh, you didn't talk about potential energy or whatever, saying like next to that 15% of the students got this particular bit of feedback, or 37% of the students got, like, would they be more or less inclined to fix something, or better or worse at fixing something that was more common or more rare? I actually don't even have an intuition about that.
Yeah, I think we're only looking at providing that kind of information to the teacher and not to the students themselves, and not making it public in a classroom. But I guess it's something to think about.
I have a question for Sadhana. So when you have this system that sort of gives you the chance to give automatic feedback, right? It sort of narrows down the kind of questions that you can ask to some extent. I mean, in this case, sure, you're grading an entire essay, but I'm sure there's like a certain complexity which the automated system will not be able to pick up. So if we have for example, you've got many courses that might just do multiple choice just so that you don't have to grade these things. But this push towards automatizing things and making things AI based in terms of evaluation, do you think that'll change the way we ask questions in the first place and is that a problem? Do you think that could be a problem?
Yeah, I mean, we have worked really hard not to do only multiple choice. So even when we ask students a multiple choice question, we ask them to explain their answer. So throughout our curriculum has been focused on writing a whole essay. And I couldn't show a lot of the examples, but students do really well. I mean, you would be surprised looking at 8th graders writing the kinds of essays that we read, but it's a challenge to incorporate that into an educational system. Like, teachers don't have the time to read everything in detail, and when we code them post hoc, we've lost the opportunity to help students think about what they wrote and how they could revise that. So I don't see us moving into like more structured multiple choice kinds of things, but I feel like we can use the automated feedback for things that it is good for, that you get some timely feedback, and then use other mechanisms that can be in the classroom. Like, for example, groups can work with each other to interpret the feedback. That is something that we haven't incorporated this time around, whether collaboratively they can understand the feedback and how the teacher can help them interpret the feedback. But I think there needs to be more of a system rather than just the automated feedback doing everything on its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting.
So I have one more question for Kevin. It might be about the part of the talk that you had to skip because of the time limits, but you talk about pluralistic ignorance as a case of social versus individual pathology. And I wonder what you mean by that, and what are the criteria for purely social phenomena in this case? And yeah, so that is my question.
Yeah, that's sort of a big topic that I'm thinking about for the book, which is this question about like, one, I think, motivation that you often see, especially in social psychology, is this motivation where you sort of see a collective bad thing, like pluralistic ignorance or polarization or the spread of misinformation or whatever, and you project it down and you say, aha, this must be because of this individual level bias or irrationality. So in polarization, you have what gets called the polarization effect, which is an individual level effect that is thought to be explanatory of the social phenomena of polarization. Of course, those might be there, so I don't want to suggest they aren't. But the thing that I want to sort of block is this almost immediate inference from, here's a group that's got some sort of like social pathology, so therefore it must be because there's an individual level bias. And then the attendant intervention, which is, if we only teach individuals how to reason better, that will solve that large scale phenomenon. So, if only we would teach people to be better, Bayesian agents or whatever, then we wouldn't have polarization or pluralistic ignorance or any of these other things. And so a kind of theme of the book is to illustrate how some of these phenomena would even arise in fully rational, or at least not, boundedly rational, but not in an obviously biased way, that then, but nonetheless project up to allow for collective problems. And so my hope is that it sort of suggests that inference that people are very prone to make, the one from bad societies to bad individuals, and then back in the other way, that good societies will necessarily, or good individuals will necessarily produce good societies, is fallacious. And so as a result, we want to be careful about thinking that that's the way we're going to fix social epistemic problems by just making individuals better. So it's very high level, and I have a bunch of examples. I think pluralistic ignorance is one, but I have some others too in the book.
Thank you, Kevin. I think you should share the book with this group when you have it up.
We'll do it. Almost. I'm almost there. One more chapter.
I'm wondering now, from an earlier comment that I mentioned that, Kevin, you kind of took out with about privacy laws. And this is about the role that conventions play in public surrounding topics that are appropriate to talk about, not appropriate to talk about, and so on and so forth, that also shut down feedback loops. So we don't walk up to someone and say, hey, I'm a Mormon, what are you? Or, I'm a Republican, how about you? Or anything like that. So what's the dynamic here about how conventions gate this information through the system? And can we spot a difference, or have you spotted a difference, I guess you should say, between information that's protected by these kind of social protocols and information that's allowed to be more public?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can't say anything more than what Christina's already said here, because I haven't tried to model these more complicated settings. So in all of my models, the thing that we're pluralistic ignorant about is sort of isolate. It's a thing that's going on entirely by itself. It's like it's the only belief in the world. So there's no network of them. Whereas Christina, I hope I'm not getting her wrong, but I think she thinks that it is far more likely in those cases where, for whatever reason, our willingness to talk about the topic is lower, either because there are privacy laws, because there are taboos, or because it's just not the done thing. I guess that's a taboo of a certain kind or something, or it doesn't come up, maybe, is another example. And so I think that that's definitely, she definitely thinks that makes pluralistic ignorance more likely to persist. I don't know if she just doesn't focus on the question, what causes it to emerge in the first place, which is, and it's not a criticism, it's just, there are different questions here, and she's focused on one and I'm focused on a different one. And so it would be interesting to know, and I just don't have a model or anything, I'm not even quite sure what the model would look like, that could potentially say, well, is it more likely to emerge in a belief of this kind versus a belief of that kind? It would be interesting to think about what a model like that would look like. I don't think it's unmodelable, but it would require a lot of changes to the model that I have, precisely because I've tried to be so simple, and you would definitely have to add in some complexity. But I think it's something that would be worth investigating, because although Christina doesn't say this, it's sort of very consistent with her that she would say that it's also more likely to arise in those contexts where there's taboos and things like that. And so a model that included those might be really interesting.
Great. Thanks everyone again for the discussion. Thank you, Sadhana and Kevin, for excellent, thought-provoking talks, and for sharing your answers to many questions we had. And as always, we would like the discussion to continue offline, and I will post the chat log on our Slack channel, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Great, thanks. Thank you, everyone.